Hello guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we're going to be looking at the last of the Amazon Boson abilities. I know, I can hear the cheers in the background. You guys don't care about the Boson. Poor Boson. I mean Manazon. This is the Immolation Arrow. So the Immolation Arrow is a very interesting ability. It's gone through a lot of changes. And if you haven't given it a shot since patch 2.4.3, I think it was, you might want to take another look at it because it's actually increased by quite a bit. And ever since the Sunder Charms came out, Immolation Arrow has definitely seen a lot better use in the past. It still has a delay, but the delay is far less than it used to be. And when I say far less, I mean like ridiculously far less. It used to have a delay of 1 full second, which was 25 frames, and now it has a delay of 0.6 seconds, which is almost twice the speed. It's not quite, but it's almost twice the speed it was before. As you can see, this is the current fire rate of Immolation Arrow, and it actually does pretty good. It's not quite as fast, obviously, as Exploding Arrow, which is this, but it's decent. You can weave it in between your exploding arrows relatively effectively, and they also enabled weaving, ability weaving, which is something that was not present in previous versions of the game. So a lot of the times what would happen is let's say you built an exploding arrows on, and you wanted to utilize Immolation Arrow. What would happen is you would fire Immolation Arrow, and as soon as you fired Immolation Arrow, Exploding Arrow would turn red, making it so that you couldn't weave them together. But as it is right now, I can very easily right-click, left-click, right-click, left-click, right-click, left-click, right-click, left-click, and as you can see, it's not bad. It actually works out pretty good. It's not causing the Exploding Arrow to go on delay anymore, which means it's actually useful. The damage actually got increased a little bit too, I believe, in 2.4, and overall, it's definitely seen some of the best improvements, I think, like bar none, that it ever could have. And the damage output is better than Exploding Arrow. So Exploding Arrow adds in any fire damage source, and so does Immolation Arrow. So the damage of Immolation Arrow at 4,217 to 4,471 is taking into account things like my fire damage charms, the Holy Fire aura that's on the Hand of Justice. As you can see, when I take this off, it's only 4,000, what is that, 4,282, and then when the Holy Fire aura kicks in, it's 4,471. This allows it to have some pretty nice single target damage in combination with the fire effect. So it has a nice little average fire damage of 580 to 674, and it lasts for a good 4 seconds, and it does burn pretty nicely on the monsters. It is important to note, though, that just like Firewall, the fire damage that comes out of this particular effect is affected by the size of the monster. So size 3 monsters, which are things like Venom Lords, Urdars, and whatnot that you often see in like River of Flame, those are size 3 monsters, and they take the most damage from fire attacks. Size 2 monsters only take about 2/3 the damage, which is going to be things like Abyss Knights, and size 1 monsters are going to be things like Flayers and Dolls and things like that. They only take 1/3 of the fire damage. But the good news is that things like Diablo, Baal, Mephisto, those are all size 3 monsters. So Immolation Arrow does pretty good damage on bosses. The other good thing is that you can stack the fire underneath of the monster multiple times so that it's constantly in effect. And it also applies on every single contact with the monster pack. So for instance, if I go down here to, say, Shank, which I think I already killed him. Let's re-up Shank. Come on, Shank. We need to murderize you yet again. The cool thing about this is that when you fire into Shank's pack, or any big pack, you get multiple fire effects for every single monster that it goes through. So you get a nice little explosion going through everything on the way, and then you also get the fire effect under every single monster. Now, there is one big downside to the fire effect that I found while I was playing my exploding arrows on last season, which is knockback. Knockback does not work very well with Immolation Arrow. You have to imagine that if you're using knockback with Immolation Arrow, it's going to knock them out of the fire, which is not what you want. You want them to stand in the fire, and you want them to get burned. You want them to continue to get burned. You want them to stand there and just melt away into nothingness. And if you're knocking them out of the fire, you're defeating the entire purpose of Immolation's Arrow's fire effect. And as you can see there, lots and lots of fire all over the place, lots of nice explosions, but it's not really something that you're going to use on its own. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to weave in the exploding arrow so that you can get multiple shots per second. And by doing this, you're going to get the highest damage output for this particular build, because you're going to be able to shoot off as many Immolation arrows as you can, which is definitely the higher damage skill. But in between, when you're waiting on that reload, you fire off the exploding arrows to maximize the damage output as much as you can, which is great. Or you can just be lazy and fire off the exploding arrows. It's up to you. But good lord, there's fire everywhere. Fire everywhere. I'm trying to think if there's anything else about this. There's really not a lot of items that have Immolation Arrow on it. The only item that you could possibly obtain that has Immolation Arrow for a non-Amazon source is the Hellrack Colossus Crossbow, which actually has level 18 Immolation Arrow charges with 150 of them. So if you wanted to play around with Immolation Arrow on a non-Zon, like for instance maybe an Enchant Sorceress or like a Holy Fire Paladin or something, the Hellrack Colossus Crossbow is the only item in the game that has Immolation Arrow charges on it. And it's a high level Immolation Arrow. At level 18 it'll dish out some decent damage, but it won't be like super duper insane or anything. I feel like you'd probably be better off with a Demon Machine Crossbow with the Exploding Arrow passive shot, but it could be fun to play around with nonetheless. Kuko Kushaku also has +3 Immolation Arrow on it, but that is unfortunately only for the Zon itself. So if you are an Exploding Arrow Zon, the Kuko Kushaku Shikaku Cedar Bow is definitely a really nice choice for an early level Exploding Arrow Zon. Hand of Justice is really nice for the late game ones. Very, very nice indeed. Because it has the negative 20% enemy fire resistance as well. Now, in the past, when it came to this particular build, before the Sunder Charms came out, the easiest way to build this was to do the Exploding Arrow only, ignore the Immolation, because it was 20 extra skill points that you just didn't really want to spend. And instead go with a Cold Arrow Freezing Arrow for another 40 points here. And what this did was it allowed you to switch back and forth between Exploding Arrow and Freezing Arrow as needed when you had monsters that were either immune to cold or immune to fire. But you no longer really need to do that with the addition of the Sunder Charms, because it allows you to bypass the fire immunity. And in combination with negative resistance equipment like Hand of Justice, Flickering Flame, or Fire Facets, you can generally get enough negative resistance to pretty much make most fire immune monsters pretty easy to kill. Right now I'm at negative 39% enemy fire resistance, and I could totally bring that up more by about 5, 10, 15% if I went with a 4-socket armor with 4 Fire Facets instead, which would be a pretty decent level. As it is right now, though, at negative 39%, really don't have much problem killing much of anything with the Immolation and the Exploding Arrow on this build. It's definitely a highly specific build. And I did test Immolation Arrow earlier in my Theorycraft video, if you want to check that out, for the Fire Amazon, on P8 Diablo. And P8 Diablo died really fast. I was actually very surprised at how fast Immolation Arrow killed him. I did not fire Exploding Arrow because it was honestly the inferior choice at that particular moment, and I was kiting. So I never really had an opportunity where it was on cooldown and I could fire something else. So Immolation Arrow just kind of melted Diablo into oblivion, and I'm assuming that's because he is a size 3 monster and the fire just absolutely obliterated him. Of course, he did have the decent single target damage of like the 4,400 per shot, combined with the physical damage on the bow and so forth and so on. But I think the fire damage underneath his feet was what really melted him down into nothingness. I think that's pretty much it for this. We covered the size of the monsters. The fire damage itself is rather large. It's like a 2-yard radius, so it will hit more than just the monster underneath. Like for instance, some abilities like at the feet of a monster you would think would only hit the monster itself. But because it's a 2-yard radius, it will actually hit everything within the 2-yard radius. So if you have the monsters nice and tightly packed, the fire is going to do a lot more damage than you think, because it's gonna nicely toast most of the monsters within range. And as far as I am aware, the explosion nor the fire can be blocked in any way, shape, or form. Which I don't know if that would actually make it useful in PvP, because you can't block the explosion, you can't block the fire, and I'm assuming you probably also can't weapon block it either, like on the assassin. And I'm assuming that you probably can't dodge it either. You may be able to dodge the arrow, but not the fire, and not the explosion. So it's interesting to think about it from that perspective, that you really can't block the fire effect, because the fire effect is just kind of something that happens. As you can see, it even works when you just hit a wall, which is something that you kind of have to remember when it comes to the fire effect, is that the fire effect will go off when you hit hard targets, which is pretty cool, and you can use that to your advantage. Like say if you're in Travancore, you get the explosion and the fire if you hit the wall. Same thing with exploding arrow, you get to add the additional explosion in. So if you're fighting a monster that's near the wall, like for instance, let's say we're in here and we find a monster that's near the wall, we can just simply fire the arrow at the wall and get an additional fire effect. Here we go, we got a couple right here. So he's getting hit twice by the explosion, and the fire effect is happening twice, because one is hitting him and one is hitting the wall. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when we are talking about Immolation arrow. And as always, keep watching.